Welcome to CNRL Author Talks, where authors come to talk about their latest books with librarians from the Central Northern Regional Library in New South Wales, Australia. This week, it's my pleasure to introduce Julie Bennett. She'll be talking about writing her first novel, the opera scene, perfume, and her debut novel, The Understudy. Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to our Author Talk today. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet today on the traditional lands of the Gamilaroi people. I recognise their continuing connection to this land and pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal people present here today. I now have the pleasure in introducing our guest for today, author Julie Bennett. Julie was born in New Zealand and migrated to Australia after her father was offered a full-time role as a tenor in the Australian Opera Company. Her first novel, The Understudy, was inspired by her experience performing as a child in the Australian Opera Company's 1973 production of War and Peace. She lives in Sydney with her husband and her gorgeous Kelpie cross-cattle dog, Riley. Please welcome Julie.
Thank you. I'll try and speak loudly, and I have an advantage because my dad was an opera singer, as Jonathan said, and he taught me how to project my voice, which has come in very handy, especially bringing up two boys. Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you to the people of Tamworth for having me. I've been really looking forward to coming to visit. My husband, Bruce, in the corner, and my cameraman, his family came from Tamworth, so for him it's nostalgia city and it's fantastic. And thanks for turning on the weather, because we've had nothing but rain in Sydney. It's a little chilly here, but it's good, it's worth it. So I just thought I'd start by talking a little bit about how I came to write The Understudy and what the journey's like for me, if that's what you'd like to hear about. And then a little bit about the book itself, and also I'll take your questions. And if you would like me to, I can also do a bit of a reading from the book. So Bruce tells me I often forget this bit, so I'll say it first up. If you don't know what The Understudy is about, it's the story of Sophie. So Sophie is understudy, or they're called covers in opera, usually, especially in the old days, to a great star who's about to go on stage at the formal opening of the Sydney Opera House in 1973. What happens though is that the lead soprano disappears, and so Sophie has to step up on stage and take on the role, and in doing so she steps into the arms of a gorgeous Italian tenor, because we've always got to have a little bit of romance, right? And but the story really focuses on Sophie's journey to becoming a star, but also the story of Margaret, who's the missing soprano, and what's happened to her, where she's gone. So there's a bit of a mystery around that as well. Just a little bit of a heads up, can be a little bit dark, can be a little bit racy, so just letting you all know. So the journey to writing the novel was this. I always thought of myself as an author or a writer, and I'd been scribbling since I learned to write, really, which was obviously for most of us about 5 or 6. And I remember telling my mum when I was certainly younger than 10 that I'd planned on writing my autobiography. And she said, "Don't you think you need a little bit of life experience first?" And I said to myself, I've got almost 10 years life experience. But needless to say, I did wait a little while. And as I said, I was always scribbling, and I scribbled some what we call now practice novels, but I hadn't really taken that dream much further. I worked, when I first left school, I worked for a bank, and then I worked in a library, actually, as a library assistant first in a public library, and then I went on to become a library technician, and I worked in the public library system, but also in university library, in several branches of a university library. And I really loved that. I couldn't believe that people were paying me to be around books. Wow! It was such an exciting thing for me. And then I'd worked in libraries for quite some years, I think it was 9, and I thought, I'd always had this dream to write for a living. But I realised that becoming an author and earning a living from being an author would be very difficult. So I went to university and became a journalist, and I worked in finance media for, I think, about another eight or so years. And then one day I decided, well, I was going to quit my job and I was going to maybe lie on a beach and write a novel. Well, that didn't quite turn out, so I started my own business, and I still run that business today in conjunction with my husband, and it's a public relations business. So after all this life happened, I woke up one day to a terrible, something terrible had happened. I woke up and I realised I was in my 50s and I hadn't written my novel. So I had a really solid talking to myself, honestly. I said, you know, you always said you were going to write a novel, you always said you were going to be an author, and what have you done? You've done, I mean, I had done those practice novels, but I hadn't had it published. So I made a promise to myself that I would try extremely hard to write a novel and have it published. And if I didn't manage to get it over the line, that's okay, because I had done my very, very best. So that's the day that I decided to write my novel, someday in my 50s, one day in my 50s. And then more life happened. But what did happen was I met Fiona McIntosh, who's a fiction author, and I went to see her author talk, as it happens, and she said that she ran this author masterclass, and so I thought, oh, I might join that. So I went and had a chat to her afterwards. She said, yes, but there's like a year's waiting list. And I thought, fabulous, because that gives me a year to write a novel. And then she emailed me a little while later, a few weeks later, and said that she had a vacancy for the one that was coming up in, I think it was April, and that was something like 4 weeks away. But I remembered the promise I made myself. I said I was going to try my very best to get this done, and this I saw as one of the steps to help me get there. So I said, okay, what do I need for it? She said, just 10 pages. You just need to bring 10 pages of the novel that you're thinking about writing, and we'll, come along. So I dashed these 10 pages off, and interestingly, the first 10 pages of the book have hardly changed. So that was really, really interesting. And then the masterclass was great. I came home and I wrote 30,000 words. Very proud of myself. And then I went to visit my girlfriend, who at the time was living in Edinburgh. And she said, hey, how are you going with writing your book? I said, I'm so proud of myself. I have 30,000 words. She's going, fantastic, well done. And she came back to live in Australia about 3 years later. She said, how are you going with your book? I said, fantastic, I've got 30,000 words. She said, you had 30,000 words 3 years ago. I want a page a day, no excuses. And that's how I wrote it. I just wrote 1 page a day until I'd finished it. Sometimes I cheated and I would write maybe 4 or 5 pages, but just eke them out to her one day at a time so that it wasn't such a daily exercise. But that's really how I did it. And I thought to myself then also, if you can't keep a promise you make to your best friend, then, that's not good. So keep the promises that you make. So then I finished the book, and that's only the first step on this mountain towards getting a novel published. The next thing that happened was Fiona had a masterclass conference where she was bringing in 5 publishers. So at the first workshop, there had been 1 publisher, and we could pitch to her. And the next one, she had 5 publishers. And that was really valuable to me because it gives you the opportunity to hear what publishers are looking for. It gives you the opportunity to meet them one-on-one. And she gave you an opportunity to pitch your idea to a publisher. So for me, that was really valuable. But Fiona's masterclass is only one way to do that. Another way to do that is, for example, the Australian Society of Authors also runs what they call, it's a pitching, I can't remember what it's called now, but you get to pitch, it's called Blind Date or something like that with a publisher, and you can pitch online, one-on-one with publishers. So that's one of the things that I say to people who want to get their novels published is, if you can have some sort of contact with a publisher, you'll be able to see what it is that they're publishing, what it is they're looking for, and what kinds of material they want, So that was really valuable for me. And then, of course, there was the magic day that Simon & Schuster Australia agreed to publish my novel. And I have to tell you, I know I'm on a podcast, so they might hear it, but that's okay. But I have to tell you that I was so surprised because I'd had some discussions with the publisher, and on one of the discussions she said, if you don't mind, I'd like to show this to some of my colleagues. And I said, oh, sure, but I didn't realise she was taking it to acquisitions. So acquisitions is the process whereby people in the publishing business decide whether or not they're going to publish this novel. I had no idea of that, so that when she rang me up and said, congratulations, we're going to publish a novel, I was just speechless. I was just, oh, that's great. And then I went, no, that's great, that's great. So that was a really exciting moment in delay for me because they agreed to publish this novel and also a second one and an option on a third one. So that was a very exciting day in my career, my writing career. So then the next thing that people usually ask me is, you know, apart from the story and having to write consecutively for 464 pages, what is it that inspires you, you know, to write, and how do you get into character, and how do you think of what's going to happen, etc. So there's two types of authors. There's pantsers and plotters. Do you understand what they are, or shall I explain that? Okay, so a pantser is someone who writes by the seat of their pants. Right? They don't know what's going to happen, and they don't know where their story's going to go. And the other people are plotters, so they plot to varying degrees. They might plot the whole novel, they might plot a little bit of it, or whatever. I'm definitely a pantser. And what happened to me during the process of writing the book was I knew the characters very well. So the first character I knew was Sophie. So Sophie is a young woman in her 20s, very, very ambitious, right? So the number one thing she wants to be is on the international world stage, and she'll do almost anything to get herself there. So she doesn't think twice about, you know, using people or stepping on toes or whatever to do it, but she does it all very nicely. But Sophie, of course, I knew her I felt like I knew Sophie really well. I think, you know, when you're young and you're excited about your profession and you want to do the very, very best, you know, that kind of enthusiasm and excitement for what it is you're doing. I thought I understood who she was very quickly. But Margaret is the missing soprano, and this book is told by both characters. Margaret mostly in 1953 and Sophie in 1973. So Margaret was a whole different kettle of fish. So Margaret's 40, which is very young also. But Margaret, you know, she is a very tormented person in the book. And I don't know where she came from because I'm not a tormented person. But it's Margaret's voice that was in my head when I was writing. And some days there's this magical thing happens. Most days you work really hard for every word, every syllable, every phrase, every sentence. But Margaret's bits it was like she was yelling them at me. She was going, tell them this, show them that, mention this, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going like, yeah, okay, Margaret, okay, I'll get to you. And so for Margaret's parts in the book, the words sometimes just seem to just flow up the screen without me doing anything. It just felt like Margaret, I know it sounds like I was possessed, but it was like Margaret took charge of her scenes, and she knew what she wanted to be in the book. So it was, it sounds a bit spooky, but it was a bit, you know, exhilarating in one way, because her bits were the bits that I felt really wrote themselves. So as Jonathan mentioned, my father has a background in opera, so I was introduced to the Sydney Opera House very young. I was 11. So I always say it's the Sydney Opera House that really inspired this novel more than anything else. I came from New Zealand when I was 9, and I was really homesick. So I was old enough to have quite close friendships at school, and my best friend had lived next door, and my father's family lived quite close. We used to see my grandparents every weekend. So I didn't really understand what it meant to move to another country, and when I got here, I was very homesick. And what happened, we moved in May 1971, and on June the 20th or the 22nd, can't quite remember, my grandfather in New Zealand died, and we'd been very close. So, and of course, we'd just migrated, so we couldn't afford for us all to go back to the funeral, so it was my dad who went back. And I was really heartbroken and very homesick. And when my father arranged for us to be extras in the opera, War and Peace, which was the first, it's generally accepted as the first opera performed in the Sydney Opera House publicly. And when I went to the Opera House, I felt it was my house. I know it's not, but I still feel that way. And for me, it's spectacularly beautiful. It's the most beautiful building in the world, and I'm not biased. I've seen lots of buildings, and I think the Sydney Opera House is something we should all be very proud of. It is majestic and magnificent and beautiful. But, you know, for all that, those are not the things that, make me feel that way about the Opera House. Yes, it's gorgeous. Yes, if you walk up the stairs into any of those theatres, the Opera Theatre, as it was called back then, or Joan Sutherland Theatre, or the concert hall, you walk up those stairs and, you know, it's like walking into a cathedral. It's beautiful birch panels overhead and the most spectacular view of Sydney Harbour. It's not that magnificence to me that inspired me so much. It's the smell of it. So if you walk through that vehicular concourse underneath the monumental steps and close your eyes, you will smell this smell, and the smell is of salt and sea and earth and concrete. And for me, it's as elemental as rain, and I couldn't be anywhere else. I couldn't be anywhere else but the Sydney Opera House. And it brings back all those beautiful feelings of having been a sort of homesick little girl and finally feeling like I'd found my home. And so that was the inspiration behind writing the book. I wanted to honour the place that had made me feel like Australia was my home. And scent, or perfume, is very, very important to me in the book. I want my readers to see, hear, touch, smell the whole novel. I want it to be an evocative experience for them. So some of the ways I did that was to introduce the perfumes that had been popular at the time. So does everyone remember this? It's 4711. So this bottle of perfume falls out of Sophie's bag one day. And I had to make it 4711 because it wasn't this actual bottle, but a little bottle like this was given to passengers on the Air New Zealand flights between Auckland and Sydney in the 1970s. And so for me, it's kind of really, really special. I'm going to hand these perfumes around, and I'm very happy if you'd like to smell or sample them, put them on, because for me, that's the whole thing, you know, experiencing. So it's I wanted my book to be a bit tactile like that. There's also a very interesting scene where Armando gives Sophie some soap. So the soap is from Nesti Dante in Florence, and I emailed them in Florence, and they very kindly sent me over wrappers of the soaps that were in the 70s. So I didn't actually describe those wrappers because back in those days, the wrappers on soaps were of women's heads and, you know, looking gorgeous, and I prefer this one, which is the lemon and bergamot. Actually, I'll read you this bit from the book first because it helps to explain my next perfume. So Sophie, a little bit of a spoiler alert, but you've probably guessed anyway. Sophie gets to go on stage on opening night at the formal opening of the Sydney Opera House, and she performs in front of the Queen, so the Queen's in the audience. So afterwards, Sophie and the rest of the cast meet the Queen. So this is my description of it. A hush settles over us, and I realise the Queen has entered the green room, escorted by the senior management team. The Duke is 3 steps behind her, his hands clasped behind his back. In his dark dinner suit and black bow tie, he is storybook handsome, but I only have eyes for the Queen. She is wearing a burnt orange gown with a short-sleeved bodice, beaded and sequined in a zigzag pattern that reminds me of the Opera House sails. There are diamonds in her tiara, in the 3-stranded necklace at her throat, and in the drop earrings at each ear. She is wearing long white gloves that button at the elbow, and over them, around each wrist, a diamond bracelet. The press is here, and she dazzles in the flash of their cameras. Even the organza of her skirt shimmers. In my kimono and American shoes, I have never felt so underdressed. She smiles and begins to walk towards us. She is not as tall as I expected. The fabric of her gown doesn't quite sweep the floor, and I catch a glimpse of silver shoes. We break into spontaneous applause. We just can't help it. I find myself counting the rhythm of her footsteps as she comes closer. 1, 2, 3, small pause. 1, 2, 3. She is walking in almost perfect waltz time. and then she stops within the space we have made for her. She adjusts a matching organza shawl with a self-gathered fringe over her left arm, revealing a silver evening purse. It reminds me of my mother's glow mesh clutch, but perhaps it's a tad more expensive. She clasps her hands in front of her, interlacing her fingers, runs her right thumb briefly over her left before unclasping them again and extending her hand to one of the 4 bases standing nearest to her. As she moves along the informal line we have formed and closer to me, I imagine I can smell the scent that she wears. I realise that I expect her to be wearing something very English, perhaps reminiscent of flowers and cottage gardens, but this is French. I'm almost certain. Soft but not delicate, roses, yes, but also vanilla and something spicier, brighter, citrus. And so I researched what scent the Queen might be wearing. So the Queen, according to the rumours, because the Queen doesn't actually talk to me very much these days, so the rumours say that the Queen wore this perfume on her wedding day. It's by Florists of London called White Rose. So when I describe it, I'm describing, I think she'll be wearing something like this, which is beautiful. And yes, I do use these perfumes because they're expensive and life is short. So also, if you'd like to spray yourself with a little of that, that's fine by me. But the perfume that I decided to have her wear is this one called Le Bleu, I think it's called. And it's a little bit spicier and brighter, and it's rumoured to be also one of her favourite perfumes. And again, if you'd like to try some, that's fine by me. The other perfume that was really important to me was Youth Dew, because when in the 1970s, Youth Dew was such a thing. You know, every young woman wanted to wear Youth Dew, but it was also quite expensive. I think it's Estee Lauder. And so the strangest thing happened, and I am a big believer in serendipity, but I have an aunt who thinks that I'm one of 4 girls. So my aunt was clearing out some things, and every time she clears out things, if she has 4 of them, she sets them aside, and she goes, you know, the Bennett girls might like to choose one of those. And so I arrived at my mum's place one day, and there were these 4 perfumes, these 4 perfumes lined up, and one of them was Youth Dew, and I went, because I'd already written about it in the book, and Mum said, yeah, I think she's had that since the 80s. And I went, that's fantastic, I have to have it. So I did, of course. And you're most welcome to also try this one, but I warn you, it's rather old and strong. And speaking about serendipity, so, you know, I had the novel accepted by Simon & Schuster, and then during COVID, the pandemic lockdowns, I was editing and re-editing and editing and re-editing. And, you know, I would read, and I would research, and I'd watch, and I listened to Madame Butterfly at least 1,000 times, because that's the opera. It's performed in the book. The opera was not performed in the Sydney Opera House in 1973. I don't think it was performed until 1978. But this is a work of fiction, right? So one day I thought, wonder what Opera Australia's got. I followed Opera Australia, and Opera Australia said that they were going to stream War and Peace, the first opera. There's some contention, by the way, but we probably don't need to go into it. The first opera performed in Sydney Opera House, and this is such a great joy to me because I knew I would see my 11-year-old self on stage. I fast-forwarded, it's a very long opera, and I knew which scene I would be in, so I fast-forwarded it. And I have to tell you that when you're an extra brought into the opera company, you're given stage instructions, but you really are only in on, you know, a couple of rehearsals at most, one of them being a dress rehearsal. And so the stage directions are kind of, well, for me, quite last minute, but the stage direction was, look, all we need you children to do is walk on stage, act like you're, you know, lost peasants from Russia, which, you know, is all about war and peace, and then walk off, right? So pretty easy, I thought. And just a couple of don'ts. Don't look at the audience, and don't worry about anything else that's going on. Just be in the scene. Okay. Sounds easy. And I thought, I'm 11, quite mature and sophisticated, and I thought that would be a piece of cake. So all I was going to do was walk on stage, act lost and lonely, and walk off again. So my memory of it was that I did exactly that. So when I watched the footage, here's what I actually did. And you're like, oh my God. And I do remember looking out at the audience, which was also the other thing I was told not to do. I wasn't very good at behaving myself. And, I didn't expect to be able to see people in the audience, but I could see at least 3 rows, and I remember the women were dressed up in gowns and jewellery and, the big hair, and I was just petrified. And then I remembered the advice not to look into the audience, and that's the last time I ever looked, because we were in several operas over a couple of years, and I didn't look again at the audience. The advice to just be part of the scene was the best advice. But the most poignant bit about that for me was that I was also able to see, I walked over from stage right to stage left, and my dad, dressed as a Russian peasant, was at the opposite end of the stage with my little sister, and as I walked past, he pulled me in for a quick hug and a pat on the head. And I know that that's such a privilege to be able to see your dad cuddle, your 30-something-year-old dad cuddle you when you're 11 years old. To be able to have that actual, memory on film for me was so, so special. So that's kind of the background of what inspired me and why it's the Sydney Opera House, really, that I found really inspiring. Yes, my dad was in the opera company for about 30 years, I think it was, from the 70s to the early 2000s. And so you also have quite a good understanding of theatrical people and a little bit about music and quite a lot about performance and about the kinds of rigours that are involved in being a live performer. Now, the other thing about writing a novel is that I wanted to have lots of small details correct. So I wanted to have, for me it was also what I call primary resources. And so that was all about getting the newspapers of the day for me. So this is the actual 1973. That was the Sunday. The Opera House opened on the Saturday, October the 20th. It opened with a concert. And a few days later, The Magic Flute was the first opera performed after the official opening. The first opera performed before the official opening was The War and Peace. So there's a lot of debate about what was the first opera performed in the Opera House. So I go by what the Sydney Opera House says, and that says War and Peace, and that suits me. So my mum gave me that. She had collected that. She gave me a whole lot of other stuff as well, of course. But I also scoured high and low. So in the book there are some of the actual headlines that were in the newspapers the next day, because I really wanted to do that, to be faithful and true to what was actually published. And this is also another paper from the day. But the one thing I love about this is, has everybody heard of Coburn's curtains? John Coburn. So when the Sydney Opera House, the curtains were commissioned for the Sydney Opera House, they had this tapestry artist, I'm not sure he was a tapestry artist at the time, who designed the curtains. And there were 2 curtains. There was one curtain for the Opera Theatre, now the Joan Sullivan Theatre, and there was one curtain for the Drama Theatre. And they were called the Curtains of the Sun and the Curtains of the Moon. And as you can see, they're quite 1970s inspired. And John Coburn was a talented artist who wanted to do the very best for the Opera House, of course. These curtains were made of Australian merino wool, and they were made in France, and he oversaw that project. However, unfortunately, they did hang in the Opera House for the first probably 6 months. However, whoever it was who decided, don't remember who, decided they were too untraditional and distracting for performances in the Opera House, and they were taken down. And I think the story goes, I did the research, but I can't remember, I think the story goes that John Coburn didn't get paid. So you can Google it and find out. It's quite a tragic and very sad outcome of what are absolutely beautiful curtains. I actually had the privilege of seeing the curtains. They were hung again in the Sydney Opera House a couple of years ago, and I dragged my sister along because my sister's a paramedic and not a writer, but she loves coming along because it's all about our history, of course. And we actually saw the curtains. They're actually quite fragile now, so then they couldn't be used, but they were in storage for many, many years. So the research process is fabulous, really, because you get to uncover things that you didn't know. I didn't know the John Coburn story. But the other thing about research is you need it for the smallest of things. So one of my very first scenes is Sophie and her Italian tenor, who's called Armando, go for a walk. I'm thinking, hey, that's pretty good, and we'll just get them to know each other a little bit by just going for this walk, right? And I go, okay, so what time of day would that have been? Well, they just had a little practice in the opera house, so it'd probably be the afternoon. Margaret was in her dressing rooms probably after 5. Margaret has actually walked up into the opera theatre to have a little private moment. So it's after 5, but it's before 6. Okay, that's fine, good, fine. So was there daylight saving in October 1973? When did the sun rise or set? So if anybody would like to know, this is sunrise and sunset for October 1973. So you have to go down, I don't know if you have to, but for me, I had to go down to the absolute detail. I wanted to get things really, really right because I wanted it to be as authentic as possible. Of course, it's fiction, but I just felt like, the same way I felt about the scents, really, the perfumes. I felt like if I'm able to deliver to the reader the authenticity of the period, including sunrise and sunset, then I feel like I've delivered a good experience. And so that's why I went down to that sort of level. Now, there's a few other little things that I'm very happy to share with you, but I thought I might open it up to questions. They should like me to read another bit first, or would you like me to close with the reading? Read a bit. Read a bit? Okay. So because this is a story about the performance, I thought I'd just read this little bit about before Sophie goes on stage for the very first time. And even though she's terribly ambitious, and this is exactly where she wants to be, of course it's a little confronting. The Queen's in the audience. She's going on as the principal singer for the very first time in her life, and even though she's been working up to this moment, she's terribly, terribly nervous. And I'll let the words speak for themselves. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Miss Gardner will not be performing this evening. The role of Madame Butterfly will be performed by Miss Sophie Carlton. I'm standing in the wings, and I hear the collective sigh, then the loud titters of disappointment from the audience. My heart sinks. When the curtains open, Armando is, as directed, already on stage with the tenor who plays Goro, the marriage broker. I put my hands inside the wide sleeves of my kimono, rubbing the goosebumps off my skin. I'm not alone, however, far from it. Oscar is back here as promised, and I'm standing only a little in front of the singers who play Madame Butterfly's friends. They're crammed so tightly together, I can smell them. Janet is right behind me. I feel her lean close to my ear. Toy, 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 Soph, she whispers. She grips my hand briefly and squeezes my fingers in encouragement. Thank you, I whisper back. I run through the opening bars of my music over and over in my head. What will happen if I miss my cue? What if I open my mouth and no sound comes out? Too late to think of it now, far too late for negative thoughts. I have to make this work. After all, this is exactly what I've always wanted. It's the very next thing on the checklist I compiled with Lady Napier's help. Perform with Armando Cecchi. It had seemed so far out of reach when I had written it down, and now, here I am. I swallow, then consciously relax the muscles in my throat, fixing my gaze on the stage manager, waiting. He is peering out from his desk in prompt corner, watching the progress of Armando as Lieutenant Pinkerton as he makes his way to greet the baritone who plays Sharpless, the US consul. I have only moments. She does okay. Thank you. So I could prattle on forever, but I'd love to take some questions if you have them for me.
And I can pass you the microphone so we can all hear you.
Hi.
How do you keep up that level of enthusiasm all the time? In writing and just in your daily life and living. What is it that actually stimulates you?
Oh, what an interesting question. I've never been asked that before. It's interesting, Jonathan, isn't it? Because we were actually having a conversation before the talk began about being, basically being introverted or extroverted. I think I am an extrovert now, but it's something I learned to become because I was actually quite a shy little girl. And I decided one day that it wasn't getting me very far. I felt like I had to be a little bit more out there in order to, experience all that life had to offer. But I think Jonathan was saying a similar thing, you can be very social and very extroverted and very enthusiastic, but you do have to have the downtime. And so, after this, my husband will be taking me out for Chinese dinner because that's what I love in a country town, and just have a little bit of a debrief. And then I will need to be a little bit quiet for a little period of time. But, I think the secret to writing novels is that that's the thing you want to come out in your book. You want people to be excited about it. You want people to be engaged and interested and want to keep reading, not just that novel, but anything you might write. And so you have to somehow take your enthusiasm into your work. And it also helps that I absolutely love writing. Remember, I was going to write that autobiography when I was 9. So I've always loved writing, and I've always loved communicating. And I think also maybe it comes a little bit from my background. My dad is actually quite introverted, but of course on stage he had to be quite extroverted, and so it was learning about performance and learning about how to engage people and to be interesting, I guess. But thank you. It's nice to hear I am enthusiastic.
What's your favourite part of writing?
There's 2 favourite parts, and this is one of them. Getting to actually talk about your book and to have an actual completed product and for people to read it. My first experience, there were 2 really great experiences after the book was published. I went to an event, it was a reader's event, and this lady rushed up to me and went, I'm sorry, I'm just such a fangirl, please can you sign my book? Which was such a wonderful thing for her to do and say, and very exciting for me. And I got my first fan letter, and the headline was just wonderful. So, being able to get the fans is fantastic. It's very exciting. And also, to be able to engage with people like yourselves here at an event is also really inspiring for me. It makes me want to continue on and makes me want to keep writing. But the actual writing, the best part of the actual writing is the first draft, for me, the first draft, because you're very free. So you just write whatever, and especially being a pantser, you just write whatever comes into your head, whatever you think you might like to happen to your characters, whichever way you want. And you don't worry too much about, does this make sense, or would they actually say that, blah, blah, blah. So it was, that's really, really exciting. You feel very free, and that's the bit that I really love. However, because I'd been a journalist for 8 or 9 years and also working in PR, I do a lot of editing. And so I became very familiar with the editing process, and it feels to me like a different part of the brain. It's kind of more mathematical. It's like, have I spent enough words on this particular scene? Do I need to increase that chapter? Things like that. It's actually, all parts are good except the very, 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 very last proof, which for me, lots of people say to me, oh, is that about, finding typos or whatever? No, I don't really worry about that. I mean, it's 115,000 words. If there's a typo in it, it's gone through lots of proofing and so forth. If there's a typing in it by that stage, it's just an accident, and there's not much you can do about it. But, and I don't know, I don't want to say, but I don't think there are. But anyway, but the very last one, before it goes to print, you just are terrified because you go, does the story stack up? Have I tied up all the loose ends? And then if I have, is it all still compelling and interesting? And so that very last, before you tell the publisher, okay, go, that very last, and I remember I stayed up all night until 5 a.m. with my final draft before saying go. I've never done that, I don't think. And I stayed up and I watched the sun come up and I went, you know what, Julie, you have to give birth to this baby. Let it go now, let it go. So I did, and that was good. And then you kind of feel a bit lost. Well, all I've got is my day job. Great. Anyone else?
Yes, I'm sorry to come late. I've just come from a diabetes seminar.
Oh.
One reason. How do you What makes you decide to write in the first person as opposed to the second or the third?
Yeah, I wanted it to feel very, because it's a historical fiction novel, I wanted to feel very now. And I thought with when you use other person, there's a little bit of distance for me. It creates a little bit of distance. So I wanted to be in these characters' heads, and I wanted to be able to, I wanted you to feel like they were real. And for me, it's just how it happened. First person and then present tense, yeah. I just thought it was a little bit different from other approaches to historical fiction.
Is there much research?
Oh, yes. So I didn't do the research for, I already knew the world very well, and I had my father's experience to draw on, and I had the experience of being on the stage myself. And I'd lived through the 70s, which is a fabulous bonus. So I think I came from a place where I thought I knew quite a lot. But and in that first draft, I didn't worry too much, about stuff. But if I came across something, so, when I explained about the time of day, and I go, okay, so if they've left the Opera House at 5 p.m. in October 1973, what was the weather like? When did the sun set? That sort of stuff was important. So then I would check it as I went. But then there was a whole, for example, in the book, it deals a little bit with the pre-Whitlam era and the things that were going on in Woolloomooloo, because that's where Sophie lives, at the time. So at the time was the Builders Labourers Federation and all the protests and the green bans and so forth. So I had to do a lot of research around that. And because, for example, there was a protest march in Circular Quay to the Rocks. So Sophie is walking to Circular Quay, to the Opera House, through Circular Quay. So if she was walking there on a particular day, I have to know if she would have intersected with the BLF, because if I have her just walking down there someday in October 1973 and not intersect with them, that's not real for me. I wanted that sort of bit to be authentic. And there's other instances like that. So I guess in a block to research was about the BLF in particular, and other things that were going on that you just don't think about. It was a very interesting period in terms of women being allowed in bars, for example, and being allowed in bars and buying their own drinks. So women were allowed in bars, but in public bars, until a certain year, and it's a bit iffy and a bit grey, they weren't allowed to buy their own alcoholic drinks. It's kind of like, what? So, those sorts of things. And, for example, we lived in Woolloomooloo for a time while I was writing the book, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to. But there was a bar in Woolloomooloo, quite famous. Lots of people would go to it. In fact, I think even Whitlam went to it. And there was a lot of art and music people who lived in Woolloomooloo because it was cheap, or they lived in the King's Cross. And there was recording studios and so forth. And so the people would go to this bar called Soren's, which was on the corner of Cathedral Street, and only a few doors up from where we lived. And so then I thought, okay, I need some real stuff about Soren's. And Soren's would have peanuts that you could shell, and you throw the peanut shells on the floor. It was a thing in the 70s. And nobody could really explain why. But also another fascinating thing I found when I started to research Soren's was that a feminist had written on the back of the toilet wall, "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle." And she wrote it there, and she wrote it in Sydney Uni, and she went on to be quite a famous feminist. Irina, I think her name was. And, those sorts of detail, for me, helped to make that story a little more authentic. Yeah, made it more authentic.
Did you say there was a second book?
Yes, there's a second book coming. I can't really talk about it right now. All I can say is it's a similar time period. So I really like this time period, the 70s, the 80s, the 60s, they're all great, but yeah, it's going to be different. It won't be the same as this book, but I'm looking forward to it. Okay. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for coming out on a really cold day. At least it's not raining. I'm always so relieved to wake up and go to an author talk and go, yay, it's not raining. But it is winter, so I know it's a bit of an effort, and thank you so much. It's been great.
For more CNRL Author Talks and other podcasts, visit our website at cnl.nsw.gov.au or follow your CNRL branch Facebook page. You can also watch many of our Author Talks. Just search YouTube for CNRL interviews. This podcast was recorded at Tamworth City Library with music by Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear, from the freemusicarchive.org. I'm Jonathan Stilts from the CNRL Library Innovation Studio. See you next time for more CNRL Author Talks.